Oh, whaley, whaley up the bank, and whaley, whaley down the brae, and whaley, whaley yon burnside, where I and my love want to gae. I leaned my back until an ache, thinking it was a trusty tree, but first it bent and syne it brak, say my true love did lie to me.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to A Maker's Pilgrimage, a podcast about contemplation, ecology, and the fiber arts. I'm Aidan, the knitting monk, and I'm coming to you from the beautiful Hudson Valley, where I'm a brother at Holy Cross Monastery. Welcome back to all of you who are joining me and have been here in other podcasts. And welcome to those of you who are checking this out for the first time. You can find me on social media as Knitting Monk, and that's both Ravelry and Instagram. And you can also read my mostly weekly meditations on contemplative Christian spirituality on my blog site, which is groundinginthespirit.wordpress.com. For those of you who have been with me for a little while, you will notice that there's a new opening for the podcast. That kind of leads me into the first thing that I want to talk to you about today, which is some changes, reflections, and decisions that I've been making. Then I'm going to get into a project that I've been working on. And then I want to do a little book review and talk about some inspiration that I have been immersed in recently. So let's get started. Just to talk to you about the changes, the reflections that I've been engaged in recently. You know, in the last episode I talked about how November to January, really because of the liturgical calendar in the Episcopal Church and also the various events in my own life, those months are really a time of reflection for me. Well, this year, that really, my time for reflection kind of came in a very physical way because a couple of weeks ago, shortly after my ordination, I just was hit with exhaustion. And then a cold came in, and I actually had to cancel a retreat I was leading and all that kind of thing. And I was laid low for, I was in bed for a couple of days, but I really am still kind of coming out of the exhaustion now. But one of the gifts of illness like that is that I've been forced to slow down, to clear my calendar. I've had more time, because I haven't had the energy to do as much, I've had more time to read, to knit slowly, to reflect more. And in that sense, being exhausted has been a real gift to me. But one of the things that has stood out to me is that my calendar is much too full. And so I've looked at ways to clear some space in my life. And I had actually considered for a while not continuing with the podcast. But of course, during that period of consideration, I was hearing from a lot of you your own reflections and the place that my reflections have in your reflections, and how my reflecting on my own life is sometimes an inspiration to you all to reflect on your lives as well. So I find this podcast is valuable to my own reflections, and knowing that it's valuable to your reflections as well encourages me to keep going with it. But I've also been thinking about and kind of meditating on changes that I want to make in the podcast in order to, I'm always, and I think I've talked about this before, I'm always looking to bring the kind of split, fragmented parts of my life together. And my knitting, my making, my sewing, and this podcast have, for the last 6 months, sort of been in one part of my life, whereas my monastic life, my prayer, my reading, my writing are in a somewhat different part of my life. I don't feel a conflict between them, but I do kind of want to bring the two together in a different way. And so, and at the same time, I've been reflecting on my making and how I engage the process of making and how I engage social media as a part of that. And kind of what are some of the pitfalls for me in all of that, and what are some of the graces and benefits for me. So that's all a long preamble to saying that I've come to some decisions to be more intentional in my podcasting, in my sewing and my knitting and my social media engagement in the knitting community and the making community. And so I am, in a very intentional way, going to use this podcast to explore contemplation, ecology, and the fiber arts. I don't have specifics about what that's going to look like from week to week because I'm very much aware of this sense of becoming in my life. And I've been reading Ilia Delio recently on evolution and contemplative Christian practice, and part of the point that she makes in the book I've been reading is about how our lives are always unfolding, and that's the pattern of the universe, is to continue to unfold, and that actually God is that process of unfolding. So I'm going to try to be comfortable as I can with not having all of those answers going forward. But that being said, a part of my becoming in this moment is that I want to be more intentional about speaking in a direct way about these aspects of my life that are a part of my monastic life and are a part of my making life, and to be more explicit about that and bring them together in a different way. So I'm going to focus in the podcast in a more explicit and intentional way on those 3 areas. And I've been doing the fiber arts piece, and I've been doing the contemplation and ecology piece without naming it in such a way. But I'm now naming it in that way. And I want to say that I do realize that with the podcast changing, that may mean that for some of you who have been watching, the podcast doesn't speak to you anymore. And there may be others for whom the podcast didn't speak before, and now it will speak in a different way. And so that's all a part of it as well. But to say a little more specifically about kind of how some of these elements come together with contemplation, ecology, and the fiber arts, there's one project in particular that I want to share with you, and it'll give a lens to kind of where I am in my own making process right now. The only thing really that I have made since the last time I podcasted, which was about 3 or 4 weeks ago, is I've made one single pair of very simple ribbed socks. These are the socks. I posted a picture of them on Instagram yesterday. These are made from a very special sport weight yarn that a friend of mine sent me from a farm in Dallas, Pennsylvania. And the tag said 100% wool. I went on the farm's website. They didn't have a lot of information about their sheep. It looks like it's a small family farm. but the tag said that this wool was from Ida, who I'm assuming is one of their sheep named Ida. Um, I did something very different with this pair of socks. I mean, you all who have been following me for a while will know that I tend to crank out projects quickly. Um, and even in my community, I'm known as somebody who is kind of constantly productive. Um, well, I mentioned that I've been sick recently and exhausted. Um, and one of the things that I have been doing is trying to be slower in my process of knitting. So I took 2 weeks on this pair of socks. I knit them slowly. I enjoyed the feel of the wool in my hands. I enjoyed the smell and the texture of this yarn. Um, I have appreciated and do appreciate knowing not just the farm that the yarn came from, but the name of the sheep whose wool will now cover my feet and keep them warm. Um, that's bolstered by knowing also the person, although I've never met this friend, not yet met this friend, it's an online friend, but knowing a person who purchased this yarn thought of me and sent it to me. And so I'm aware of all of these stories that are contained in this one pair of socks. It's both the farm, it's the friend, it's the monastery here, it's me and this moment of my life where I have knit them. It's the intention of making them slowly and intentionally, allowing the socks to be a kind of manifestation of becoming. You know, they start off as wool on a sheep's back that's then sheared and spun and, well, prepared for spinning and then spun and then skeined and then sold and then sent and then wound and then knit stitch by stitch by stitch until eventually I have a pair of socks that will then be worn, that will keep me warm and will eventually in time wear out. They'll probably be mended. And then eventually they'll get to a place where they're not wearable anymore and they will become something else. Likely because they are 100% natural fibers, they'll be put in the compost pile at some point and will go back to the earth. That will then become a part of the flowers and the vegetables that we grow here at the monastery. So in a way, these socks that I've made for myself have grown up from the earth that fed the sheep, that gave the wool, etc., and will eventually return to the earth. But these socks have been a part of my contemplative practice for the last couple of weeks that I was working on them. I want to share with you a process that, or a kind of way of looking at the world that I find very meaningful from Thomas Berry, who has died now, but he's was a great naturalist and Christian theologian who wrote a lot about ecology and contemplation and Christian theology. And he talks about the universe process as a threefold process that the parts of which are differentiation, subjectivity, and communion. So what he means by these, and by the way, I want to say for those of you who are kind of more well-versed in the world of contemplative practice, there is often a lot of talk about a unitive way of seeing versus a dualistic way of seeing. And that terminology really grates on me because I find it to be a very dualistic way of looking at the world. So I discovered this threefold way that Thomas Berry proposes, and for me it's a wonderful alternative to unitive and dualistic. So that's just an aside, but so these three components, what he means by these and what he talks about in his book, The Dream of the Earth, is he talks about differentiation. Differentiation is the principle that everything within the universe, every piece of the material world, is unique. There's no blade of grass that's exactly like another blade of grass. There is no human being who is exactly like another human being, either physiologically or in terms of personality and spirituality. Absolutely everything in the universe is radically unique, is different, differentiated from everything else in the universe. And that differentiation is not a bad thing. It's a part of the natural kind of makeup of the universe. And then he talks about subjectivity as each of those radically unique elements of the universe is also radically subjective, has this deep, deep mystery about it that can never be fully comprehended. You know, I can never fully know another human being. There's always an element of that person that is mysterious to me. The same thing with the blade of grass. I can sit and look at that blade of grass forever, and I will never fully comprehend that blade of grass. So everything is also radically subjective, has a deep reality that belongs only to it. And a component of that subjectivity is that I also am a mystery to myself. I never fully know myself. And also, because I'm involved in an evolution over time, I'm also changing and developing. And so I'm never the same from one moment to the next. So there's a mysterious component even to our own lives. And then the third piece, communion, that one of the ways that we can interact with one another, actually the way that we're called to interact with one another, is from subject to subject, to be in communion from subject to subject, which means essentially to contemplate the other without trying to subsume the other and make it into me. I can be in relationship in that way, where I'm in communion with, I respect the otherness of the other, and yet I'm still in relationship with that other. And together, in communion with one another, we create a larger whole, a whole that is more whole than each whole already was. So if you think about that in relationship between two people, take of your best friend in the whole world, for that to be a true and deep friendship, I am totally whole here in me, even as I don't understand the full mystery of who I am. And I'm in relationship with this other person who is totally whole herself, and yet together in communion we form a larger whole that is even more whole than the two wholes already were. Now I realize that all of this may be abstract for some of you, and it can certainly be that way, but to take the particular example of these socks that I was working on, and this for me is a part of how contemplation, ecology, and the fiber arts come together, is that in making these socks slowly, stitch by stitch, the whole that I am was engaged with the particularity, the differentiated subjectivity of these, the wool that made these socks. And together in that relationship, there was a kind of communion that happened so that we both transcended our particularities in that moment, so that the wool became something that it wasn't, which was this pair of socks. And I became something that I wasn't. I grew into a more whole version of myself, even in a very small way, by having an experience of presence to the moment and to the wool that made these socks. That is the way that I pray, really. I mean, prayer, contemplation is a kind of presence to the reality of this moment. And that's a big part of my practice. So that's just a little bit of where I am with contemplation, ecology, and the fiber arts. Another piece of that I wanted to talk about is specifically the idea of slowing down. Now, I'm able to engage in the process of making these socks as a contemplative practice, using that model of Thomas Berry, because I did them in a way that was slow and intentional. In this process, I've really been influenced lately by Hannah Thiessen and Meg of Mrs. M's Curiosity Cabinet podcast, who both talk about the process of slow knitting. Hannah wrote the book that's kind of going around right now called Slow Knitting, and in my time of fatigue, I've been reading a lot more, and one of the books that I have read in the last couple of weeks is this book, Slow Knitting. It's really an excellent read. I would encourage you to check it out if you have the chance. Hannah, as if she's my good friend Hannah, but Hannah Thiessen kind of breaks down slow knitting into these various chapters, which are source carefully, produce thoughtfully, think environmentally, experiment fearlessly, and explore openly. And so in each of the chapters, she writes about the process that she's talking about right there, and also then gives you some profiles of different yarn companies who are engaged in this kind of making. And sorry about that, somebody came by to say hello. So I believe I was talking about the book Slow Knitting, and it's really a wonderful book that explores the whole process of knitting and really slowing down our knitting. And she doesn't talk about it from a perspective of prayer and contemplation, but it really, I think her insights really lend themselves to experiencing the world in a more, a way that's more grounded, that's really more open to really engaging the reality of who I am and who another person is, or who the environment that we live in is. And so when she's talking about sourcing carefully, she's talking about a love of material, that one yarn is not like another yarn. And so she talks about getting to know the yarn in our wool collection, and getting to know its characteristics and where it came from, and what the land is like that the sheep or the alpacas or the cotton or whatever the yarn is made of, what that land is like. She talks about producing thoughtfully. That is a process of being intentional about the projects that we're working on. So I don't mindlessly go from project to project, but I actually stop and I consider, what do I need in my life? or what do I want to make for somebody else, or what yarn do I have available, and what pattern would it lend itself to. And she says in that capacity that actually swatching is not a chore that has to be done, but it's an enjoyable part of the process of making. She talks about thinking environmentally, which is about placing our making within the larger context of the planet that we are a part of. And so that's both about being intentional in our sourcing of materials so that we are aware of the environmental impact that our making has, but also about attuning ourselves to the rhythms of nature. And so for her, she gives the example of, in the depths of winter, working with kind of heavier weight wool, and making sweaters and larger projects that will keep her warm in the winter, whereas in the spring you might start spinning. You might knit in the winter and spin in the spring and make socks out of cotton in the summer. Just being attuned to the rhythms, which are both the rhythms of the natural world and also the rhythms of your own life. So I know for myself, for instance, my knitting really does slow down a lot in the spring and summer months because I'm out in the garden a lot more. That takes up more of my time, and I have less time to give to the knitting. And then in the winter, I have more time to give to the knitting. So it's also placing our making within the rhythms of our own lives. She talks about experimenting fearlessly, that if our knitting and our making is really about a whole process of life, that there's not a way to get it right. And so we really can try out a bunch of different projects, different yarns. It kind of makes us freer in our whole engagement with what we're about. And she talks about exploring openly, connecting ourselves in community with other people who are also engaged in making as a process of becoming. So, like I said, I really recommend this book to you. I'm actually going to give away my copy of it. I'm done with it. There are beautiful patterns in the book, but none of them are patterns that I intend to make. So I feel that I have gotten what I needed out of this book. And so I am going to put this on the Ravelry group as a giveaway. I will probably draw the winner and give it away before the next, I'm going to draw the winner on January 1st, which will probably be before I record another podcast. So I'll just send you a Ravelry message to let you know that you have won. But for the prompt, I'll start a new thread for it, and the prompt will be to share a knitting or how you want to engage your making in a more thoughtful way in the coming year. And that can be something as simple as, I want to learn this new technique, and it could be something as large as, I want to use my making as, I'm having trouble thinking of something larger, but however you want to engage your making in a more thoughtful way in the coming year, and to have a discussion about that. So do check out the Ravelry group if you are interested in having a copy of Slow Knitting. It's a wonderful book, and I really recommend it. And it really, as I said, has already impacted the way that I have been making over the last several weeks. I've been thinking a lot about this community of ours and noticing that there are really beautiful aspects of the making communities on social media, that we encourage one another, and there's a lot of ideas that are shared, and I feel really lifted up in my growing commitments to engage making in an ecologically informed way, and an ecologically sensitive way. But for all of that, there is also a lot in the making communities that's really just another version of the consumerist society that we live in, with the emphasis on having as much yarn as possible, the emphasis on novelty, on flashy colorways, and I often hear it said that you can never have too much yarn. Well, I don't think that's true. I think you can have too much yarn. I think if you have so much yarn that it would take you 5 to 10 years to use all of the yarn that you have in your stores, that is too much yarn, you know? And so I think part of where we need to come back into balance as a community is really asking ourselves, like, what are we about here? And unbridled consumerism is a part of what's destroying the planet that we live on. And I'm convinced that it speaks to a real spiritual deficit in our lives, to this real sense that we have a loss of meaning, we have a loss of love, and if I don't love myself, then then I'm going to try to fill that hole with stuff. So along those lines, I'm really, I've just finished reading this book. Let me see if I can find the quotation that I'm looking for here. Oh, no, it's not there. I'll find it somewhere. Yeah, this is The Unbearable Wholeness of Being, God, Evolution, and the Power of Love. It's really, really, really brilliant. It's also very dense. But this is what she has to say, and I think it really fits into the context of what I'm talking about with consumerism. She says, Homo sapiens are the last arrival in the evolutionary story, the most complex and intelligent species, and yet the most unnatural species alive. We separate ourselves from the whole and refuse to be part of the whole. We kill and maim our own species as well as other species. We lock ourselves up in artificial environments with artificial lighting and sit behind artificial computer screens, sometimes creating artificial lives online because our own lives are so boring and empty. We boast of our intelligence as human creatures, but we have lost the human center that feels for another, that weeps for the poor and oppressed, that has a righteous anger in the face of injustice, that forgives our enemies and shows mercy to the wounded. Being created for wholeness in love, we are the most loveless of creatures, filled with fear, jealousy, anger, hurt, resistance, and rivalry. A center empty of love is ripe for extinction because there is nothing to live for. A center empty of love is ripe for extinction because there is nothing to live for. Wow. I don't think that that's the whole story of either humanity or of our community of makers. There is a lot of love a lot of support, a lot of connection that happens. But there is also the other side that we do sometimes fall into the trap, and I do as well, of trying to have as much stuff, trying to make as much stuff, as fancy as possible. I mean, I'm totally guilty of that. The more cables, the better. Maybe I don't need to make things that are so elaborate with so many cables. Is there a part of that making that is trying to fill a need in me? You know, because I know that the things that are covered with cables get 2, 3, 4 times as many likes as a pair of simple ribbed socks. You know, I get a lot more adulation for the all over cables than I do for the simple ribbed socks. So, you know, there are those parts that we're trying to feed the emptiness inside sometimes with our making, rather than seeing making as a way of becoming, as a way of communing with ourselves and with other people and with the world, but in a way that's responsible and respectful of the boundaries of the other, that contributes to the flourishing of the whole. So a part of what I'm talking about here is that am I able to look at a skein of yarn and to see within that skein of yarn the sheep that it came from, the farm that it came from, the people whose livelihoods are supported by the purchase of the yarn, as well as the earth and the environmental impact that that purchase has, the economic impact and the environmental impact. Or do I, which is to see the whole subjectivity of the yarn, or do I look at it as just another purchase to scratch an itch? It's an object to be consumed, which frankly is the force that's behind all of the evil in our world, from white supremacy and racism. I mean, it was the kind of patterns of consumption that saw black people as objects to be bought and sold. That's also behind environmental degradation, that the planet is a resource rather than a living entity. You know, that's behind sexism and misogyny, that women are a kind of property, again, to be bought and sold. That's behind all of these various kind of forces of oppression and domination in our world. And we're not free of that in the making community at all, but we also, through our making, can resist those forces. And for me, the contemplative piece of that is to begin to see myself and others and the whole planet, everything on it, as a radical subject to be in relationship with, to care about the mutual flourishing of me and the planet and all the subjects on the planet. So, I mean, I know that sounds like a lot coming out of an encouragement to knit more slowly, but to knit more slowly helps me to be in relationship with what I'm knitting, rather than to see it as an object just to be finished and given away to begin on the next object to fill my own sense of emptiness. And that may have a lot more to do with me than it does with you, I don't know, but I do know that I'm certainly not at all free of kind of the forces of objectification and commodification as they relate to knitting and to making. And so slowing down and being more intentional is very much a part of my own process right now. So those are the reflections that I have for you during this podcast. As a part of my slowing down and being more intentional, I'm also going to podcast less often. I anticipate recording one episode a month, probably 45 minutes to an hour. And I also am going to let go of what I have felt is a very strong obligation to respond to every comment. I'm going to try to respond to comments and messages as much as I'm able to. But also please know that even if I don't respond directly to your comment, I do read them all, and I do find them really a meaningful part of my own reflections. So I thank you for watching. I encourage you to check out the Ravelry group called A Maker's Pilgrimage. There you will find show notes, you'll find conversations about the projects we're working on, you'll find the giveaway for slow knitting, and you'll also find a thread that we've put up recently called the Fiber Exchange, which is a place to put up our own kind of fiber tools that we're not using anymore, which could be anything related to the fiber arts. It could be fabric scraps and remnants, it could be skeins of yarn we don't want anymore, it could be books, it could be knitting needles, it could be whatever. And that's a place to put that up there because there may be somebody else who would love to have what you don't need anymore. And we can exchange with one another in that way. It's not a place to sell things, so please don't put anything on there asking for a price for it. It's to give things away. So do check out the Ravelry group. Again, thank you for watching, and I look forward to hearing from you. Please don't hesitate to reach out, and look forward to speaking with you soon. Till then, happy and slow knitting.
Oh, Willie, Willie, up the bank, and Willie, Willie, down the brae, and Willie, Willie, yon burnside, where I and my love want to gae. I leaned my back until an ache, thinking it was a trusty tree, but first it bent and syne it brak, say my true love did lie to me. Oh, wherefore should I busk my heed, and wherefore should I comb my hair? For my true love has me forsook, and says he'll never love me mair. 'Tis no the frost that freezes weel, nor blowing snows in clemency. 'Tis no sick cold that makes me weep, but my love's heart grown cold to me. Love is handsome and love is fine, gay as a gem when first it's new, but love grows old and waxes cold and fades away like summer dew.